is Helen Jensen. I'll be co-hosting this webinar today with Solveig Hansen, and we'll just go through a bit of housekeeping first. So our webinar is about the CANOVI 2021 variety trial results today. A note about language. So this webinar is going to be conducted in English, and questions can be asked in either English or French, either out loud or in the chat. And we just, due to various circumstances, we were just not able to arrange translation of the slides or live translation today, but we will make French language versions of the slides available after the webinar. Alors, un mot sur l'interprétation en français. Aujourd'hui, le webinaire va se dérouler en anglais. Les questions pourraient être posées en français ou en anglais, soit en clavardage ou soit à voix haute. Il y a eu vraiment des circonstances qui ont fait qu'on n'a pas pu faire une version, arranger la traduction à l'avance pour ce webinaire. Mais on va faire des versions françaises de diapositives après le webinaire. On va les mettre sur notre site web, puis on peut les envoyer aussi aux participants. Also, we acknowledge today that the ancestral and unceded territories of all the Indigenous people that call this land home. And we invite you to reflect on this question of what our obligations are to Indigenous people who first inhabited and continue to inhabit this land, how we can support existing local struggles of Indigenous peoples along with preservation, resurgence, and development, and how do we live and farm as good treaty people. We also want to aim to cultivate a safer space. In this webinar, we hear feedback time and again that the presenters at our events and gatherings are very open and honest with their stories. And with that in mind, I want to mention that the goal for this event is to create a safer space. Presenters are sharing, in some cases, personal experiences, which requires vulnerability, and we hope they will feel valued and respected. We hope that everyone feels comfortable sharing, asking questions, and learning together. If you're someone who tends not to speak a lot, you can try to speak more. If you're someone who tends to speak more, you can speak a little bit less and be mindful. And yes, I think that is it. And I lost the rest of my notes. I'm sorry. Give me 1 second here. Right. It's important to speak from our own experience. So use, I, and if you're using the term we to define who you mean by the we. And if you please reach out if you have concerns or ideas about how to do this better. You can either send a private message or follow up after the event. It's our role to make sure everyone feels safe, and our team is committed to acting in support of this. Next slide. So, sorry, the how to engage slide. Oh, excuse me. Right, so your video can be on or off as you wish. You can please change your display name to something, well, to the right name for you. Please stay muted when you're not speaking. If everyone could take a minute to introduce yourselves in the chat, that would be great. And for asking questions, you can use the chat or you can unmute and start your video. And when it's sort of the right time to do questions, we'll make a space for that. Okay, so now we'll go into the actual nitty-gritty of the webinar. So again, this is the CANOVI Vegetable Variety Trials 2021 Results webinar. This is showcasing a lot of work by Solveig Hansen at University of British Columbia. She's a postdoctoral fellow and has a lot of experience in breeding, predominantly with beets, but now with carrots for the past few years. And she will be presenting a lot of the results of the analysis of the variety trials that she's been doing. I'm Helen Jensen. I'm the research manager for the Gouda Family Initiative on Canadian Seed Security, and I do collaborate a lot on these CANOVI trials and have been over the past years. Next slide. So the CANOVI program, I think most of you probably know it, but it stands for Canadian Organic Vegetable Improvement. And it's a partnership between the University of British Columbia and the Bauta Family Initiative on Canadian Seed Security, with a strong regional partnership at Farm Folk City Folk in Vancouver, but also with all the Bauta host organizations throughout the country. And so the question is, like, why improve vegetables specifically for Canadian organic farms, given that we do have a pretty significant mainstream seed supply? The reason is that Canadian vegetable growers tend to rely mostly on seed bred and grown outside of Canada, much of it by multinational companies. And although there are some excellent seed companies serving organic growers in North America, seed shortages can be triggered by various environmental, economic, and political situations. And farmers need the knowledge and community to source seeds that work well on their farms, or sometimes to grow those seeds themselves. Another big important reason for CANOVI is adaptation to regions and also to farm systems. We work mainly with organic farmers or farmers who grow in a way that is, organic or ecologically friendly, and they have really specific needs. They have more limits about what kind of controls they can use for insects, for pests, for disease, and also what kind of inputs they can use generally for fertility. And also organic farms tend to be quite heterogeneous. I mean, both because they're spread across this very large country of ours and because they use just a number of different management systems. And what we really want to do here is both identify good varieties for Canadian organic farms and also develop new varieties that would fill some of the gaps in the existing supply. And now into the actual trials. So in 2021, we had 2 CANOVI trials. One was Rutabaga, a second year of Rutabaga trials, and also a second year of Radicchio trials. And for Rutabaga, we had an original 34 participants who signed up. And for Radicchio, there were 50 participants. And CANOVI aims to make variety trials easier, both by providing facilitation and planning. So like we do some of the steps of just getting the data sheets ready, like getting the seeds ready, sending them to you, putting them into a kit, and just sort of just taking that off the plate of the farmer. And we also want to make them more effective by allowing people to share with a whole network of farms to share their results, their observations. And so this is a good number of people to have. Logistically, for the trials, we set up sets of varieties, which usually are about like 5 or 6 varieties at a time, which is kind of the limit of how much one person can really grow and evaluate meaningfully. There's some instructions on the plot layout, like generally farmers are encouraged to grow the vegetable the way they normally do, but we do have some basic parameters for like how to plant them, how much space, and so on. Here you have the 2021 Rutabaga varieties listed. In this case, there were 5 core varieties everyone did, and then some extra ones people could add on based on their interest. And this is just a little bit of preliminary information. So a lot of you participated in an exit survey last fall, just to give us an idea of how the trials went and what you're interested in the future. And based on the respondents of the survey, this is not everyone who participated, but we did have like a lot of participants in Ontario, British Columbia, Quebec, and Nova Scotia, but also like there are some people in the other regions who probably just didn't get to the survey. And I think more interesting is like the distribution of who is doing the trials. So here in this chart on the right, you can see they've got like quite a few seed producers trialing the vegetables, which is really great because ultimately we are looking to integrate this loop of finding good varieties with people producing the seed of the varieties. There are also a large number of market gardeners, but also some home gardeners as well, some researchers and educational institutions, quite a few community organizations doing some of these trials as well. And the other category is actually someone who identified as a seed steward specifically. And so we really appreciate all of your participation this summer. And Solveig is going to go through the results with you in more detail now.
Awesome. Thank you for the intro. Hi, everybody. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to put some faces eventually, if you want to turn on your cameras eventually for questions and stuff, but to the names I've been seeing in all the trial data that I've been going through. And so I'm going to share data with you, or trial results with you, in a few ways today, and I wanted to orient you to them so you know what you're looking at on the slides that follow. So you're familiar with SeedLink because that's the interface you use to enter your trial data. And SeedLink gives trial results in a few forms. One are these bar plots right here. Can you see my cursor? Helen, can you nod if you can see my cursor when I move it? Great, thank you. So these, I'll show you at the end how to go into SeedLink, and there's a new interface where you can not only manipulate these bar charts by the trait you're interested in, and you can see these pie charts, which basically say how many people said, yes, I would like to grow this again versus no, I don't. And sometimes that's as informative as anything, as kind of a broad look at the variety. There are also these little icons where you can actually see a gallery now of all the photos that all of you took throughout the season. And it's a pretty cool way to see how the same variety ended up looking in different stages of growth on different people's farms. You can also see people's comments and get kind of a feeling for how these varieties did for different people. And so this middle section, we also did statistical analysis, because while SeedLink does show, differences in mean scores, it doesn't put it in context yet. I know they're working on it, in context of the variation in the data and the number of people giving the data. So, so that's what statistical analysis does. So I did that, and when I talk about on the slides that follow, you're going to see these little symbols by some traits. So if there are the more stars there are, the more significant the differences, or the more confident we are that that difference is due to an actual difference in the variety versus just random chance. All of the analyses are corrected for variation by participant. So people who used the upper end of the scale versus the middle part of the scale versus the lower end of the scale, we can still see like the relative differences among their ratings, among your ratings. Okay, so that's kind of an orientation to what we did. And I just wanted to thank all of you who uploaded photos, because it made it really easy to make a photo-rich presentation, and you will probably see you may see some of your photos up there. Oop. Okay, so we'll start with Rutabaga trials. We trialed Rutabaga both this year and last year. Last year, there were 7 total varieties, and you were asked to choose, I think, 5 or more of them. So 20 people participated last year, 22 this year finished the trial. This year, we had that core set of 5 varieties, which were chosen based on what did well in 2020, and then 5 more varieties that people were interested in, and you could add on as many of those as you wanted. So we saw in both years, there were significant differences in varieties in terms of vigor. Last year, we only saw, big differences in yield among varieties, but this year we saw a few more. We saw disease resistance difference, flavor differences, germination differences, some slight differences in marketability both years, and not much difference in some of these other traits. So we'll dig into each of those a little bit in more detail. Ooh, there we go. Okay, so the cool thing about doing this a couple years in a row is that you can see trends in what varieties have similar performance for certain traits over time. So with respect to vigor, which was the trait that we saw really big differences in for both years, we saw that Alta Sweet was most vigorous in both years. But in 2020, York was the variety that showed less vigor, In 2021, it was the Fortan family heirloom and Helenor, which is interesting because Helenor did not show low vigor in 2020. So those are the kinds of things we can see with this kind of data, these broader trends. And I just want to invite you as I go, if you have questions, I'm glad you like the stars and clouds. Please pop them in the chat, and then we'll stop at the end of the Rutabaga section and answer questions or get your input about Rutabaga, and then move on to Radicchio. So the Rutabaga, as I look through all the data, kind of sorted themselves into two groups. There were some higher rated ones, some lower rated ones, and a few that kind of ended up in the middle. So for green topped rutabagas, Ned Morska really stood out. It was significantly higher for marketable yield, disease resistance, flavor this year. And then when you see these words that I don't have symbols by, that just means they were higher on the graph, but there wasn't a statistical difference. So Ned Morska really stood out as the best green top variety this year, and it got a pretty high would grow it again rating. Gilfeather also did relatively well, but it was less of a standout. Among the purple top varieties that did well, Helenor was a big favorite last year, especially in the more in the warmer growing zones, like 5B to 8 or so. And this year it did well for some of these, for appearance, disease resistance, flavor, but it didn't do well in terms of germination and vigor. I've noticed that germination and vigor tend to travel together, which maybe isn't surprising. But anyway, Helenor was less of a standout this year than it was last year. But still, 83% of people said they would grow it again. So that's still a strong recommendation. Joan was favored a little bit less, but still, you know, good ratings, but not statistically higher than the others. York was interesting because it got a high grow again rating. So 83% of participants said they would grow it again. But it didn't stand out in any category. So it was solid. It's also a longer day variety. So for people with shorter seasons, you might have had trouble getting it to size up, but some people didn't. This was not my photo. My York did not look this good, but someone else's did. In terms of the lower rated varieties, I guess we'll say that Laurentian and Alta Sweet were solidly in the middle. So there were, Laurentian did have trouble with germination this year. Alta Sweet did well on a few traits, even significantly higher on germination and vigor, but it didn't yield well overall this year, and people didn't like the flavor as much. I know that it looked like a real mess for me, but this is not my picture. For other folks, it didn't. So it was about a half and half. You can see would grow again, would not. So Fortan family heirloom was the reason that we saw the significant difference in disease resistance. It was basically that Fortan was significantly less disease resistant than everything else. For us, it was very obvious that it had lots and lots of club root lesions or swellings, and most of the other varieties had none for us. And you know, given the ratings you all gave them, it seemed like it didn't for you. So unfortunately, it didn't do well for that, and most people said they wouldn't grow it again. For the green top varieties on the lower end, De Krasno ended up on the lower end of a lot of these traits, and Melfort was very vigorous at first, really germinated well, was very vigorous, but you'll see when we look at some of the flavor data, it did not do well in terms of tasting, and in terms of generally yield and marketability. Ooh, I see the chat lighting up. Okay, cool, we'll get to those in a moment. In terms of flavor, we did a few things here. Well, so the on-farm trials, those are the ratings that all of you sent in. And we had asked that you bake rutabaga, since most people eat it cooked. Although some of the varieties really aren't bad raw, I think. Tastes kind of like jicama, especially the green top ones. I digress. we did a cook tasting with the UBC farm staff, and then at the BC seed gathering, we did an arrangement with these muffin tins where we sent people home with 6 varieties in a muffin tin and some baking instructions, and then did an event where a chef did some cooking demos and a Q&A, and then we all tasted our rutabagas and sent in data via seedlink. So in these trials, we saw a few themes. So Ned Morisco was among the more liked in the, both the on-farm trial data for taste and the farm staff trial. So that, like, for that reason and the field performance we saw this year, I would say if your market will accept a green topped, or you can convince them to accept one because you're like doing a CSA and you can talk up why it's cool, it could be one to try. And then among the less, like poor Melfort did not do well. And also, I guess we're not sure whether it's a true rutabaga or a turnip. The leaves for us looked very different. They looked much more like turnip leaves than less of the oleracea character that we saw in the others. So and Fortan with the clubroot susceptibility plus the lower flavor liking, that could be a reason to pull back from that one. So let's see. I'm just leaving this slide in there. This is these are kind of take homes from last year. Last year, we were able to do an analysis by both variety and like growing zone, northern versus southern zones, or warmer versus cooler zones. And I'd like to do that again this year, or at least try it and see if we see differences. The other thing I'd like to do is do an analysis of the core varieties, or the ones that we grew both years, and see if we see significant differences over time. So all of that I would like to wrap up in a final rutabaga trial report. But this is where we are now, and this is a good time for rutabaga questions if we want to go there. Helen, do you want to drive that bus?
Sure. Yes, sure. So lots of rutabaga questions.
Cool.
Which is great. Let's see. So there's a question from Dr. Mohabala. For conducting trials, so is randomization layout a must or not? And for rutabaga, what is the appropriate plant population for conducting a trial? So population, I assume like the size, the number of plants.
So these are great questions. In the trials we're doing here, we're basically counting each farm as a replication or a replicate, and there's one rep at each farm. So given that we're only laying them out once, basically any order could be considered random, because we leave it up to individual growers to make this work within their system. So some people might be growing them from one end of a bed to the other. Some people might be growing them across multiple beds. We don't prescribe what the spatial layout needs to be, just the total number of row feet. We went with 12 row feet per variety because that size plot was generally workable on our participants' farm scales. People are growing on a lot of different scales within our trial network, and certainly on farms across Canada. But for a market garden scale, this is enough plants to be able to see real differences among plots, but not so many that it takes over such a meaningful part of your production area that you can't participate. So that was the logic that went into our plot size, and the appropriate population. Yeah, it just depends on what you're doing. But for this scale, I think it makes sense. Does that make sense?
I definitely agree that I think for the rutabaga, they're uniform enough that you can really see what they look like in that scale. When we get to the radicchio, it might be interesting to see what people thought, because I think that generally the amount of radicchio people are growing, it's not always enough to see all the variation within the population, because there are so many differences. But yeah, there's another question from Rebecca, which is about, did you find any regional differences in your stats? So this question came up a bit before you presented some of them, but it's so interesting. It's so interesting that there are. And I don't know if you want to elaborate any more on that.
So for 2020, so basically seed linked doesn't, for places in the US, it automatically calculates or your growing zone or your hardiness zone. They don't have that functionality for Canada yet. So last year we manually imported all that information. Unfortunately, this year we don't have it done yet. My inimitable work learned Judith, who did a lot of the nuts and bolts data work that you're seeing presented here. She's working on that now. So I do want to run that analysis and see if we see regional differences like we did last year. There were a few differences that came out in the regional analysis, like the Hellenor being a standout in the warmer zones or the longer season zones. And I want to see if we can see that again. But yeah, we just haven't been able to take that step yet.
And speaking of the Hellenor, Evelisa asked about if the lower ratings in Hellenor germination could be due to the seed versus the variety. I personally think so, because I grew it in both years and it was just such a huge difference that I thought it was probably seed lot.
That makes sense to me. Yeah, we bought it from Johnny's this year, and I would have to look at where we bought it from last year, but it could have as much to do with the seed production conditions, etc. Yeah.
We tried as much as possible to get seeds from the same places, but given, if you recall last year, like there was like a massive seed shortage, it was really hard to get seeds. So a lot of the time we just couldn't get it from the same places before. And that has introduced a little bit of a random element into the trials, unfortunately.
Okay, should we, any more Rutabaga questions are welcome either by chat or just by turning your microphone or camera on and speaking. I'm also curious whether this is congruent with what you saw on your farm, or if there are things that are surprising you. Any varieties that you saw that were really standouts now or later. I'm interested in that.
And I'll just note quickly, I noticed there's a couple people who joined by phone. If you want to ask a question and you're here with us on the phone, you can just hit *6 to unmute yourself, and we'll hear you.
Okay, great. I think we'll dive into some Radicchio, and more Rutabaga thoughts or questions are welcome at the end. Okay, so for Radicchio trials this year, it was really a Radicchio festival. Last year, there were 13 varieties trialed, 4 different types, and people could just pick what they wanted for their farm, what was relevant to them. So 3 to 15 people trialed each variety. But we found that since diversity in Radicchio is so broad, both by maturity time and type, because they were bred in these very distinct regions of Italy and had these distinct types to them, we thought it would be most useful to divide the varieties into sets by type and maturity date, and then try to hone in on meaningful differences between varieties that way. So it's not comparing, so we're still within each set, there are often different types, but so it's like we're not comparing apples and oranges, but we might be comparing like tangerines and oranges, and we just have to like understand that's part of what's happening here. We also added pink types this year, which I was really stoked about, and I know a lot of people were requesting that, and we'll talk about how that all ended up. So for the early red radicchio, this was a pretty popular set. There were 13 participants who did this set. We had 3 traditional Chioggia types. So Chioggia is the most well-known type of radicchio. It's the most commonly seen at farmers markets, and certainly it's probably the only type of radicchio you'll see in a grocery store here. And then we had these 2 rosette types, or what we thought would be rosette types, that Chris Thoreau found, who's the person who was filling the coordinator role between myself and Alex. And we thought that those would be cool to try. So because we had these 2 very distinct types, and because they performed very differently, that explains a lot of the differences we see in the data. So basically, The Chioggia types were significantly more liked in terms of appearance, marketability, uniformity than the two rosette types, which ended up being elongated plants. I think for most of us, for some of us, the stems colored up. For some people, when you look at the photos, they didn't color up, but they weren't the type anyone was expecting. This perfect rosette certainly happened somewhere, but it didn't happen anywhere that we grew them. Also notable was this Vesuvio, which is an open pollinated early Chioggia type from the breeder is Smarties.bio in Italy. And those varieties are offered through Uprising Seeds now, which is in Washington, I believe, or Oregon. It was not significantly different for any trait than the two hybrids, although the two hybrids were liked slightly more. They're slightly more uniform, as you would expect from a hybrid. But Vesuvio did really well. And my personal experience of tasting it was that the leaves were more succulent and sweet than the hybrids, which were much more, the traditional bitter taste of Radicchio. So for me, that was a standout. The assorted set, I think this was the most popular set that we trialed. So there were 25 people that participated in this trial or who finished it. We had 2 Castelfranco varieties, 2 Treviso varieties or Treviso Precoce, these kind of long football shaped varieties with wide ribs, wide succulent ribs. 1 Verona variety, which is kind of a like a squished football. It's a short squat variety, really striking in color. And then 1 Delucia variety, which almost looks like a speckled iceberg lettuce. So when you look at the cumulative ratings, so like if you go into the seed length display for this, the cumulative ratings are almost exactly equal across the board. But when you dig a little deeper, there's a little story in the data that revolves around the 2 Castelfrancos and then this Belfiore, the Delucia type. So this Variegata del Castelfranco, which is a pretty traditional Castelfranco type, it was more winter hardy and more vigorous than all the varieties except for this early Treviso, but it was rated lower for marketability, appearance, and flavor. In my experience, the leaf was much thicker and the flavor was much more assertively bitter. This Belfiore Mirabella, which is another Castelfranco type, but very different in character, much thinner, more delicate leaves, a much more compact plant. For me, easier to harvest, less leaves, flopping around, and certainly much more liked overall by trial participants than the Variegata del Castelfranco. Also want to say this early Treviso, this comes from Frank Morton, who's a breeder in Washington. It's named early Treviso because it's different than the Treviso Tardivo types, which look like sea anemones. Those are the twisted types that need to be overwintered and forced. It's not particularly early maturing though. So we put it in this set, not knowing when it would mature, and it ended up maturing later, and that could account for some of its lower ratings because it just wasn't ready when the rest of them were. This mid-season red set was, this was the one that the least people participated in. So there were 8 people that finished this trial. It included 2 Treviso types and 2 Treviso types, a Verona and a Chioggia. There's only one statistically significant difference, and that was pretty weak in that Giulietta, the Verona type, had a slightly higher marketable yield than this, the Chioggia. But we can still see a difference in overall preferences, but that are more trends than statistical differences. So Giulietta showed higher ratings for appearance, marketable yield, marketability. It's really a beautiful plant, but lower ratings for flavor. This was one of the varieties we tasted at our Radicchio Fest that we put on with Farm Folk City Folk, and it was widely agreed that it was quite bitter. Polarosa, which is the Chioggia, showed lower ratings for appearance, marketable yield, marketability, uniformity, but it germinated great. Among the Chioggias that we saw in all the trials, it was not a standout. There were unless you really need this mid-season time slot, there were other Chioggia types that were better. And of the two Treviso types, Treviso misula was preferred over Regina Rosa. The mid-season variegated set had 17 participants. There were 2 Castelfranco types and 2 De Lucia types. Again, there was relatively little difference overall. In overall liking, it varied slightly, but generally 2/3 of people liked all of them. We do see that Delta was significantly more uniform than De Lucia. The other De Lucia type had higher germination than Fenice, and showed high ratings for bolt resistance. So I also think it's delicious, but that's just one person. Fenice was rated higher for marketability, yield, and flavor, but interestingly, still slightly lower grow it again rate than Beatrice. So go figure. And this De Lucia was rated a little bit lower for a few traits. So not huge differences, generally all good varieties in my estimation from what I saw on our farm. The late Red Radicchio, this had 9 participants. We had 2 Chioggia types, 2 Treviso types like the last time. We also had the only unanimously approved variety in Pacifico. We saw that Rubro was really Rubro was on the higher end of all of the significant differences we saw in the trial. So higher germination, higher vigor, better flavor than Pacifico, and then it was also rated highly for several other traits. So that was one of the best Chioggias that we grew at the UBC farm. It is a late season Chioggia, so it won't work for everybody, especially if you have a shorter season. But if you have a space for a long season Chioggia, that one was really a standout in our trials across the board. Pacifico was an interesting character. It was on the lower end of the comparisons for germination, vigor, hardiness, and flavor. Quite bitter, strikingly bitter. Can be worked with in cooking, but very bitter. But it's beautiful, really deep color, striking white ribs. So I'm gonna get, so that lent to higher ratings for marketability and marketable yield, because it is definitely something that will sell, and hopefully the person who buys it knows how to mitigate that strong bitterness of Radicchio. And then Bottiglione was on the lower end of several comparisons, but still 83% of people would grow it again. So certainly a marketable variety, it seems. And our last set, the late variegated, had 18 participants. It had 2 Castelfrancos and 2 of these beautiful pink Veneto varieties. You'll see that both of the Veneto varieties were liked or received exactly equal grow again evaluations that were, just better than half. Of the 2 Castelfranco varieties, Lucrezia was significantly preferred, rated higher for uniformity and winter hardiness than one of these pink varieties. Good yield. The 2 Castelfrancos were pretty similar on our place. The pinks were very slow to size up. They are definitely a late season item, and late to color up. It wasn't until, for us, really the last 3 weeks maybe before harvest that they started to show that really deep pink blush. For us, the leaves were very thin, almost papery, and like I wish they were more pleasurable to eat, but they were a little hard to take. Of the 2 of them, Rosado did receive slightly higher ratings kind of across the board. So if you want to try one, I would recommend the Rosado. Radicchio flavor, we evaluated in a couple different ways. One was Radicchio Fest, and I'll show you results on the next slide. And for that one, we evaluated 5 mid-season varieties because that's what was mature when we did the tasting, of five different types. And then we did several tastings at the UBC Farmers Market, which had a lot of potential, but Vancouver is cold and rainy in November, and not that many people want to eat raw radicchio at 11 in the morning. So we didn't get a lot of participation at those, and we'll probably gravitate toward the bigger events for future tastings. But what we did learn, we had 49 participants. We saw a variety by preparation effect with regard to sweetness for Beatrice, sweetness and overall flavor liking. That's what the flavor column means. So Beatrice was liked a lot more and was perceived as more sweet after cooking than before cooking. So that's interesting. You see the Giulietta, that was the beautiful Verona type. It was perceived as more bitter. So it was a standout for bitterness. The cooking method was just a simple saute with a neutral oil and some salt. So that bitterness could really be offset by different flavors, creaminess from various cheeses, etc. There are ways to make that an asset and not a liability, but in a simple cooking preparation, it was pretty bitter. And once again, we see in general in the vegetable tasting work that I've done, bitter and sweet tend to be perceived as opposites. When there's less sweetness, more bitterness is perceived, and sweetness tends to travel with flavor liking. Bitterness tends to travel opposite to flavor liking. Maybe not super surprising. But we did see big differences between cultivars for all of the tasting traits except texture. Okay, I'm gonna go back. We don't want to get to carrots yet. Radicchio questions for discussion.
Yeah, so there's one question in the chat right now, which is about percent germination. And is that a varietal trait, or is it more dependent on the environment where the seeds have been stored and kept before planting?
Yeah, that's it's definitely both. There's a big, I guess, environmental effect. If you want to think about environment as everything that's happened, well, number one is how mature the seed got, how much it was allowed to mature on the plant to get big, robust, mature embryos inside the seeds. So that's one thing. How well it was cleaned to blow out the light seed or the less mature seed that will germinate less well. So there's seed maturity, seed cleaning, and then of course seed storage. How cool it was kept, how many years old it is. Like, seed companies do germination tests on their seeds, at least most of them do, every year to make sure they're above a threshold, which I believe is usually 80%. And if it's less than that, they'll overpack and tell you so you can overplant and still get the germination rate you need or the number of plants you need. But it's good it's good to know, but it's really hard to pin down the source of that variation. Yeah.
I have
a bit of question. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a bit of a question for the growers on the call. So, because I'm located in Quebec, and I did try the long season variegated and pink set, and we waited until I think early November to harvest, and the pink ones, they changed color, but they turned into more of a rusty color. Like, it never really got to that nice pink that I know that at UBC they did get. So I know it's possible. And I was curious if there were any other people who tried those sets and how you did with the pink color. Like, did it sort of turn out how you expected, or did it look a bit different? Yeah, I don't know, maybe no one here did, but feel free to put an answer in the chat or turn on your microphone and let us know.
That's also an interesting thing to look. I did look through those photos this morning on the SeedLink site. And you can see the variation in pink hue from place to place. And I feel like that's a thing that would develop with cold, but I don't actually know that. So for like what amount of cold and when. Okay, well, if there are no Radicchio questions, we'll move on to carrots and the future. Also curious if anything about these results surprised you, or yeah, any standouts from your trials I'm also interested in. Carrots. So as probably many of you know, the BC crew has been working on a carrot breeding project for the last 4 years. It was started because the BC growers, and I know there's lots of interesting carrots across Canada by this network, which is really fun. The BC growers in particular wanted a orange nonce type storage carrot that was sweet and could be produced well for both roots and seed in BC to, you know, decrease dependence on hybrids like Bolero, which is one very popular kind of go-to hybrid for many years. I think it was released in 1989. So it really has become an industry standard for many people. And so people were looking for options. So it's a, you know, it's a seed security project and also just a fun breeding project. So this is Phil Simon. He's the carrot breeder at the USDA carrot breeder at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And this is Michaela and Katie from Organic Seed Alliance, which is based on in Port Townsend, Washington. And they have been doing carrot breeding for organic agriculture for, gosh, 6 or 8 years now. And have just a lot of expertise in, in developing populations specifically for organic conditions. So the folks on this project at that point, Alex and Chris, worked with Phil and Michaela and Katie to select some possible parent accessions out of their organic carrot breeding material from El Centro. That's where they have their winter root nursery. Brought them up here and trialed them in our fields, started them from seed, trialed them in the fields, and then found 3 of those parents from the CIOA, that's Carrot Improvement for Organic Agriculture, that's their project. 3 of those lines, along with Rumba, which is an open pollinated nonce cultivar developed by Nash Huber down in Washington again. So the parents are 1 OP cultivar, 3 organic breeding lines, and we made we'll just say made a mass pollination in the greenhouse. So our cycle is summertime root production, wintertime seed production in the greenhouse. So these were the parent selections. So mass selection was performed in both 2019 and 2020, meaning digging up the whole population, laying it out on tables like you see there, and going through one by one and doing basically a sequential selection process for first, you know, root shape and being free from, you know, disease lesions that would inhibit storage. Then once the carrots with poor shape or anything like that are eliminated, going through and tasting by cutting the tip off and, you know, eliminating anything with a poor flavor and trying to select a population that looks like what you want your final cultivar to look like. So that was done for 2 years. Oh, and so for those of you who don't know, this is Alex, who held this postdoc position for the first 3 years of the project. This is Chris, who both filled in between Alex and me, and also just finished his master's related to this project. You may have interacted with him. Then this year we did half-sieve family selection. So we had 54 plants in our isolation last winter. We harvested seeds separately from each plant, planted them out in separate plots, and then first selected among families. So we laid them out like, oh, and this is Judith, who did all the data work and lots of field work. laid them out and sorted marketable and unmarketable plants, and then those with carrot rust fly lesions. We did cover all of these plantings with row cover because there's a pretty high carrot rust fly population at UBC Farm. And you know, we can argue about the marketability of these. It depends on your market, right? But counted this way and then went through a whole list of phenotypic traits from depth of color to shape, degree of blunting, smoothness. And then, so we, among the 54 families, we selected the 15 that were the best, and then selected within those families for the individuals that most fit our desired phenotype. Then we cut them and eliminated everything with a yellow core, because that, thanks to our consultation with Phil Simon, learned that yellow cores once in a population are difficult to get out. So I guess they're in there, so we're doing our best to get them out. They still taste fine, but it's like it's less visually appealing according to our I guess the carrot phenotype that's most desired by most markets. So selected roots. The seed production slide is in a couple slides. This is the other thing we did. We screened several accessions for carrot rust fly resistance. There are some accessions like this really cool purple inbred from University of Wisconsin-Madison that, you know, had, this was one of our half-sib families from the CANOVI population that we left uncovered. And you see that the majority have, you know, carrot rust fly lesions that are noticeable enough that you might have trouble selling the carrots. But in this population, you know, it's a later variety. You can see a lot of carrots that just didn't size up, but only one touched by carrot rust fly in an uncovered planting, which was significant. We also grew a wild accession that was supposed to have some carrot rust fly resistance. It didn't have any rust fly lesions, but it's a wild carrot and a very long season and not possible to keep alive to use as a crossing partner. So, but we did save a bunch of these, and we have them growing in our greenhouse with a variety of possible crossing partners. And with any luck, we'll get a few to Nick or Flavour at the same time, and we'll cross them and see what we can make. We've also working on a red carrot breeding project that David, who I may have gotten off the call by now, but the regional coordinator for Farm Folk City Folk here in BC, and Chris started a couple of years ago in response to growers noting that most red carrots bolt early, or many of them do here in BC, because of our high latitude, etc. So the project was to make a red nonce-type carrot that didn't bolt early. And we are making progress toward that goal, we hope. This is one of the, some of the selections we made this year. This was grown on 6 farms, and we were using selections from 4 farms in our overall population. So that's happening too. In the greenhouse this winter, we're putting up carrot cages tomorrow. We'll get the seed production going. And you all will have a chance to trial these things this year. We're really curious how they will look as populations compared to, you know, a couple of the standard hybrids that are widely used, plus some OPs. This Touchon Deluxe is this is produced by the BC Eco Seed Co-op, and it's kind of a workhorse for one of the farms that we work with closely here. And then Dulcinea is another OP nonce type from Fruition Seeds in upstate New York. And then for the red cultivars, we've got our CANOVI Red Dragon, which isn't red through and through, but it is purple, and some people use it for that color diversity in their carrot mix. 2 widely used F1s. And then this one, Carnelian, which was selected by OSA, and is going to be marketed through High Mowing Seeds next year, but y'all will be able to get a sneak peek of it and compare it to our CANOVI red population this year. So really excited about the carrot trials. We're going to do replicated trials here at UBC and hopefully at University of Toronto, mostly because we discovered that the soil is variable enough here that we were seeing, big differences in carrot growth just from one end of the bed to another or in beds next to one another. And the farmers there agree that that's just an issue with this farm. And so just in an effort to get a real look at this, a more thorough look at this variety, we're going to do a replicated trials here. The on-farm trials will be single rep trials, 12 row feet per variety, 5 to 6 per trial. And we're going to send you all an email next week with several links. One of them is going to be to the carrot sign-up survey, where you'll be able to say, which population or both you would like to trial, and where to send the seed. The seed will be sent in late May or early June, which is late, but that's because we're waiting for the seed to mature in the greenhouse. So hopefully that will still work for most people. It'll be a later planting. And we may have to eliminate Dulciva for that reason because it's a long day carrot and I don't know if it'll finish. Okay, let's see. And then looking beyond that, 2022 or this season is the last year of this CANOVI project or the funding for this CANOVI project. So we're working on what the next step will look like. We have written a proposal for the Organic Science Cluster 4, which is the next iteration of the grant funding that this project is funded on. Our approach is, 3 approaches: participatory, genomic, and functional trait approaches to climate change resiliency on small farms. We're choosing to focus on carrots and salad greens because those are 2 crops that, I don't know if I'm going to get the organization right. The research bodies are, Helen, what is it OSC? Or I'm sorry, Canadian Organic Growers. Who's choosing to focus on carrots and salad greens?
Yes, it's Canadian Organic Growers who had put that as a priority. Yes. Okay,
so they've done supply chain or value chain analyses of several different crops that they see as where there's growth potential for Canadian organic production of these crops, starting with seed. And so we're looking to integrate there, partly because, and with carrots, we have a good background. There's been, 4 years of carrot trials and another one coming this year. And we've done some breeding work. So we have something to go on. That's where we're going to look at what's called a genotype environment association. So basically looking at carrots that were either wild carrot accessions or domesticated carrot accessions that evolved or were were adapted to different parts of the world, and then associating those with different weather conditions, especially drought stress and heat stress. I would also love to do water stress if such things exist, because that's obviously part of climate, the trends we're seeing with climate change. And basically seeing what genomic patterns or what genomic markers are associated with adapting to those regions. And once we know that, we can look within cultivated carrot germplasm and see if we can find some accessions with those characteristics and use that as breeding material. Like use that as parent material that we can then select for both adaptation to market, what our market wants, and what does well on land here. So that's the idea with that. And then the functional trait approach is basically like trying to dig into this idea of regional adaptation. And we know that just having something selected in your region, like in broadly the Pacific Northwest for us, doesn't guarantee that it's going to do well on any specific farm, because like Helen was saying, in introduction, organic farms are really heterogeneous. There are different soil conditions, there are different microclimates, different management practices, etc. So what elements of locality are important in what we call regional adaptation? And what this could get at is like, what strategies does the plant use to do that climatic adaptation? So working with Marnie Isaac, who's a functional trait ecologist from University of Toronto, to dig into that. That's what we're proposing. And so and those are the sciencey parts of what we're proposing. And then the thing that's cool about this network is that it allows us to ground all that and how things actually do on farms. Because it's easy to say, we found these carrot accessions that should do great in like drier climates or more variable moisture climates, but it's really important to know how they actually functionally work. Anyway, so that's that, and we really want your input on how that develops. We're putting that if we're invited to submit a full proposal, that will be done this spring. So this CANOVI Farm Club here is basically a place to give your input in shaping that project. In terms of variety trials for the next 5 years, you know, are carrots and salad greens enough? Within salad greens, what's interesting to you? Do you want to do more on-farm breeding? Do you want to do more variety trials? And what kind of variety trials? You know, do you want to trial commercial material? Do you want to trial more breeding lines, etc.? So that's that, and that poll is another thing that's going to come out to you in the email next week. And then finally, talked to you all earlier about some work we're doing on data collection, data presentation, and dynamics of trust, like knowledge and expertise, openness and honesty. And I always can only remember 2 of the 3. Anyway, several of you agreed to be interviewed this spring. We'll also do a focus group, so that's coming too. Okay, there are questions in the chat, and I've been talking for a while. Let's talk.
Sure.
Go ahead.
I put the link to the doodle poll in the chat as well. So if anyone wants to just go in and fill it out now, please feel free to do so. And if not, you will get the link next week as well. There's a question in the chat that's interesting that I do not know the answer to. It's about conducting trials for carrots in the winter season in Bangladesh. After harvesting the roots, we kept roots for shelf life study, and we observed in some varieties the orange roots turning into a purple color. And do we know why this happens? I do not. I don't think I've ever observed that.
I have not experienced that. I mean, I've certainly experienced both orange and purple carrots, but I haven't experienced color coming out in storage. But this couldn't have planted a better question. Our next webinar, or one of the webinars coming up on March 25th, so almost exactly a month from today, is going to be with Phil Simon, the carrot breeder from Wisconsin, and the OSA folks on carrot color breeding. The things that are, because it's a really cool way to get into both simple and complex inheritance of traits. So talking about what's known about carrot color, what's dominant to what, and then some of these muddier things or less clear things, especially like this. I don't know about this, and I did work with carrots through 5 years of grad work, and I have not heard of this phenomenon. And you know, we also saw some yellow off types in our families this year, which is interesting because yellow is usually dominant, and curious to think about where that yellow is popping up from. So yeah, please join us for that, so we can ask that question to Phil.
Becca's suggesting that sometimes like orange carrots turn a bit green at the top, or no, turns a bit purple at the top when sticking out of the ground, and maybe it could be similar, I guess, like some kind of a light response to light.
May I share my experience? This is Mohammed from Bangladesh.
Please.
Yeah, very interesting presentation, because basically I'm a product development manager for East West Seed International in Bangladesh. We received some exotic materials for conducting trials of carrot in Bangladesh. And basically, winter season, we conducted trial. We planted seed in month of October, and harvested 100 days later. Yeah, it is very much interesting because we harvested roots. Some roots, the shoulder become greenish due to the coming up above the ground. But after harvesting, we kept roots for the shelf life study. Yeah, the roots sometimes become a purple color. We thought this is maybe due to the parent line. Maybe the color expression is happened, but exactly don't know what's the behind. But also when we kept the outside, not in the room temperature, the cooler time, the color become more purple. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Did you see, did you see any hints of purple before you put them in the cooler? Or did you see no purple before you put them in the cooler?
In cooler temperature, it's become more popular.
But there was a little bit of purple even when they were at room temperature.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. I mean, that I generally associate, like the purples are anthocyanins, and those generally are, more concentrated at cooler temperatures, which is why anthocyanins also produce the purple in radicchio, which is why you get these deeper colors in cooler temperatures. But there has to be some, like they have to be producing anthocyanins anyway, which is something that not all carrots do.
Yeah, maybe, but in our trial, we kept Taki varieties also. Taki Japan, but we didn't find this type of symptom in Taki varieties. But
interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's definitely. So you're right. Like thinking about the parent material, like there's obviously there are anthocyanins being produced in whatever accessions or cultivars that turn purple, whereas the Taki varieties probably, like they're not producing any anthocyanin in any conditions. I would love to learn more about that. Yeah, those color pathways for sure. I would love to stay in touch, and I would love for you to join us for that color genetics webinar.
Okay, I have photos. So maybe if you can
great.
share the email, then I can share the photos also.
Yep, I'm putting it in the chat right now. Yeah, please send.
Yeah, thank you.
Me. I'm curious.
Yeah. Thank you.
Let's see. Oh, so dragon variety is pretty, but the leaves come off too easily to be used in a bunch. So like a poor top attachment.
Yeah, exactly.
That's interesting. We didn't include that as a criteria for carrot evaluation in the past. Would that be something good to include on this year's trial?
Yeah, it really depends on how you are marketing your carrots. So during the growing season, we loved having bunches of orange carrots and then bunches of mix, what we call rainbow mix. And yeah, dragons is a little bit more stubby than some of the others, but the most frustrating part is that they would come off the leaves too easily and just fall out, and then your bunches are not the weight that you want.
Totally.
So I think it's important. Like we just gave up at some points and just put them in quart baskets and sold them that way, but they don't look as pretty.
Yeah, definitely. And there's actually been a lot of carrot research at UW-Madison on breeding for top size and top strength for organic carrot production, both for being able to not only sell bunches but also harvest carrots, whether it's trying to like lift them out of the ground by their tops after maybe like loosening them with a fork or an undercutter. but also the canopy for shading out weeds. You know, early vigor and canopy formation, they've identified as a pretty key trait for organic, for being good for organic production systems. So widespread agreement for sure.
So maybe for that
important.
reason, also important to put on eval data sheet things.
I totally agree. And that's another thing that we would, this CANOVI Farm Club, we're kind of hoping will be a place to get more direct input, like more frequently through the season, in terms of, what we can do to make this research more relevant. And I'm also interested in like hearing like the story of varieties through a season. Like the numbers tell you something for sure. Like we can definitely see trends in how varieties did across Canada. But I'm also interested in just like hearing narrative style, how things are doing. Because everybody knows how every variety is doing on their farm and what ate it at one point in the season and how it pulled out of it and all that stuff. And yeah, there's good information there to be gained, I think. Let's see. So this is our thank you slide. And also thank all of you for coming. How are we doing on time? So we do have like another 15 minutes if people have more questions. Just say the next 3 ways to engage are let's see, in order, sign up for carrot trials. So that survey is coming out next week. I think we're asking for signups by April 1st. So sign up for carrot trials, come to the carrot breeding webinar on March 25th. This will all be in the email. And the CANOVI Farm Club, let us know which of the dates in like, I think the 2nd and 3rd week of April work for you. And if none of them work, and oh, Eric says I have a question, great. We'll have time for that. Drop us an email or write a comment on the doodle poll. Like if you need an evening time, I'd be open to doing an evening club as well. I don't want to speak for Helen, but I could do one solo to try to accommodate more folks' schedules, especially since I'm on Pacific time. Like your evening is my afternoon for many of you. Yeah, Eric, if you want to unmute, you're welcome to.
Okay. Hello, first of all, thanks a lot. It's a very interesting summary of all the work. So it helps to put a lot of things in perspective. The question I have is more with a focus on the seed saving. So when you were looking at supplying seeds for the trials, and I'm thinking mostly about the radicchios, would you be able to identify maybe 2 or 3 varieties that are standouts, that have good marketability, but where there seems to be a lack of seed? In other words, if one was to get into production, which I'm doing, is there something that would be more interesting or more meaningful to try to go with for radicchio? But that also question for red carrots. I did a lot of research lately looking for specific varieties of French sanguine carrots, which I had a lot of difficulty to identify because some names sometimes perhaps between Europe and North America lead to confusion on my part. So
interesting questions. So for the radicchio, you're looking for varieties to produce seed on, or varieties that are good varieties but where seed security is less?
Something like that. Perhaps some seed producers are neglecting some varieties that would be interesting to keep around on the market a little bit more upfront. Although I realize it's a specialty kind of thing, but
yeah, that's interesting.
And I'm from Quebec, I should add, so perhaps the choices would be different in our climate
Mhm.
than they would be in BC.
Right. Would you be looking at, you'd be looking at a shorter season varieties?
It really depends.
Okay.
That's a good question, because there was some talk earlier about winter hardiness, but
Yeah.
some of the past year I planted later and was actually able to have better flavor when I
Mhm.
harvested in November. But this year I planted everything way too early, and
Uh-huh.
some of them actually rotted as I was trying to keep them in the ground longer.
Got it.
So
Okay.
I need to rethink the whole strategy for some of these varieties, but I want to narrow it down if I can.
Right. Well, we can, I think what the trial results will give us, it'll definitely highlight some standouts. And I think if I were just to, maybe I won't try to pull them off the top of my head now, but yeah, not from memory, but we can definitely identify standouts. As far as like, we got these from a variety of seed companies, a lot of seed companies that are, you know, focused on OP varieties and organic production systems, but that are, you know, pretty established companies and that have kind of networks of smaller farms who produce seed from them, for them. So I don't totally know about the seed security aspect. Like, I don't know of any of these that are like, you know, in danger of disappearing.
Or perhaps there are less available. But actually, as I'm discussing this right now, I'm realizing that it's so local specific to my province, for example. So I would probably need to see what works best in my area, and then see if there are some rarities that I would like to produce.
Right. I have a feeling that in Canada you'd be more like, it's a fairly new crop here. Like, I don't like it, people just haven't been producing it, like, as opposed to Rutabaga, where that's like very traditional for some communities, and they have, you know, varieties they've been curating for, you know, decades and decades and generations. The Radicchio is a little bit newer here.
Right.
I think like a lot of the,
that's great. Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, a lot of the varieties that we source, like the ones from the Smarties breeder, like they're really only available in the, like we were able to kind of get them through networks, but a lot of varieties, they're actually quite hard to get, to order them from Canada and receive them.
Yeah.
So that is like some information we could, I guess, provide to you, like kind of the list of companies that we did source from last year and which ones actually do ship to Canada. However, a lot of those varieties do tend to be the more long season, like more adapted to like the Italian Mediterranean environment.
Right.
They might be less interesting in
Actually,
Quebec.
I did see when you provided us with seeds, you had the list of the places where you sourced them. So I was able to look up these suppliers.
Yep, and all of them are in the US, and all but one will ship to Canada. Seeds from Italy doesn't ship to Canada. And we were able to, you know. Oh, good. Yes, thank you, Rebecca. That's the document I was thinking, but I have my screen full of other things. Yes, but they're all gettable here for sure.
All right. Thank you. I'll look that up.
Great. Thank you for the question. And yeah, Rebecca, thank you for the link to the seed finder.
Yeah, I was going to say, Eric, if you want to find varieties that are not produced by many seed companies in Canada, I always love going to the seed finder, ecological seed finder, and just seeing what is available. And if you click on a variety, it shows you how many different locations offer that variety. So often, if there's only one, that means it's less secure. So I mean, you'd have to probably do your own variety trial to see how they do in your climate. But
Absolutely.
that's a thought.
Yeah, it's a good one, and I do use the seed finder a lot, but yeah, I'll discover the rare one and try to see if I can do something with that.
Cool. Yeah, other questions and thoughts are welcome. Did anybody make friends with Radicchio or Rutabaga this year, having not been friends before or not been acquainted before? I definitely did with both crops. They were both new to me.
I was wondering if Rutabaga is more popular in Ontario or in BC or in Quebec in the general public. Would you know that?
Helen, I think this is your wheelhouse.
I do not have any idea about BC or even on, I feel like in Quebec, there's a certain affection for it but it's also like, I think like Eric is, it's kind of like the staple food that is in certain dishes, but we don't necessarily get excited about it. There was recently this whole thread on the AGM listserv about that, with people kind of falling into the camp of like, yes, it's just a very pedestrian crop, and other people saying it's actually really delicious and great. I feel like people everywhere might be a little fall into that on either side of that divide. But I don't know, anyone, Becca, what do you think about Ontario, how people feel about Rutabaga in Ontario?
It's an interesting conversation. It's an interesting question, because I think I just came out of a conversation where we were talking about cultural crops, meaning crops that are important to different groups of people, maybe different cultures. And I think Rutabaga sort of falls into that. So there are folks, maybe I'm just throwing it out there, if you are from Scotland, you might really want your neeps and haggis and on your plate, and that's really important to you. Neeps being another name for Rutabaga, or but what in conversations that the Bauta team has had, I think my feeling from that conversation is that in the prairies there was a lot more interest in the Rutabagas. Perhaps maybe just culturally there's more folks from Eastern European countries in which Rutabaga is important. Versus some of the folks that I'm working with here in Ontario. It's hard to answer your question, but I think it depends on who you ask. It stores
Totally.
so well, which I, as a grower of crops, is something that we can have over the winter in a CSA, a winter CSA. Rutabagas are a great addition, so that's also a reason I like it here in our climate.
Right. Thanks.
Totally. But in my heritage, I'm of mostly Norwegian extraction. And for like my grandparents left that behind. It was like their survival food, right? Like, because it stores forever and it's just a lot of calories and you add cream and there you go. But they didn't love it. They wanted to have it for holidays. Like the same time you would have like some of the other traditional food, like lutefisk, that it was like a special, though, very distinctive food for the Norwegian immigrant community. But it wasn't a normal everyday thing at least for my family.
The Maritimes. The Maritimes is it's a very important crop here for specifically cattle, all sorts of ruminant animals, and people.
I learned that there was a public Rutabaga breeder who's based in Newfoundland, so
Wow.
that's cool.
I didn't know that.
Steph Hughes told me about that, about a coordinator in the Atlantic.
Amazing. And Tiara says there are quite a few people in Alberta interested in growing Rutabaga. Dr. Dean Spanner used to be a Rutabaga breeder. I don't know him. Wow, fun. Maybe we should have a Rutabaga breeding webinar. We did this year. Never mind, with Clint.
The Melford variety that
right.
was in the trials this year was from Atlantic Canada, from the Atlantic Canada Seed Bank as well.
There was this most lovely news article that came across my desk. I'm going to put it in the chat about a Quebec gardener growing the largest, what they're calling turnip, but to me is clearly a rutabaga.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it is of value to folks.
Totally. And I think turnip is a legitimate like name for rutabaga in some, like that's just what some communities call it. I think that's not a mistake. All right. Well, other thoughts, questions? We're coming up right to the hour and a half, and I think we were aiming for an hour and a half for this. Happy to hang out and chat for as long as people want. Well, not as long as people want to, but for a while. But we can also close it up and thank everybody for your attention and participation and for submitting data. My goodness, it's really valuable. Thank you, Elisa. Well, good. Increasing curiosity is, you know, maybe that's a step before falling in love.
Catherine, did you have anything? I saw you were unmuted for a moment there. No? Okay, good.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks, Sylvain, for that just amazing overview. That was really
My
great.
pleasure. Yeah, and printed trial sheets or trial reports, you know, coming this year to sum up the work of you all in CANOVI in the past 4 years. Pretty awesome.
And in the
Okay.
interim, remember SeedLinked is there for looking at the results whenever.
Oh,
you
I forgot to demo SeedLinked. Gosh darn it. Would that be helpful? Should I show people how to find the photos and stuff? If not, it's okay, but I could put some screenshots in the email I send out next week. I totally forgot about that.
I mean, yeah, a couple screenshots would probably be good, but maybe just a reminder to go look in SeedLinked and.
Sure.
And if
Or
there are those
if
new
people want,
features.
I've got one up. I can just screen share it right now if anybody's interested. Like we can call this officially over, except anybody wants a tour of SeedLinked so you can see the photos.
Yeah, that sounds good. Let's say.
Should I go for it? Okay.
Yeah,
Let's
sure.
see, we're gonna
And
go
for those who don't
here.
want to, can't or don't want to say, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay. Can you see my screen? You can see the
Yes.
SeedLinked interface here. Okay.
Yeah, we can.
So this is the, and if I move this up here, am I looking at you? Can we, that's better. Okay.
No, I don't. Yeah,
Can you
I
see it?
lost your SeedLinked, so.
Okay. All right. Then we'll stop doing that.
Yeah,
There we go.
back.
Okay. We'll do that. Okay. So you can, if you hover over any of these bars, you can see what you rated, the average rating, and the number of reviewers. So like this doesn't do statistics, but by looking at the number of reviewers the rating is based on, you can get some idea of like how many people's thoughts went into it. You can also select by trait. So this is a total of all the traits, with 5 being basically good and 1 being bad. But then if you just want to look at, say, germination, you can uncheck all of those and see how things did for germination. And then you have the helpful pie charts over here for just how many people wanted to grow this again versus not. To find the photos, you click on the tiny photo icon. So this is the gallery for indigo. And you can see how things looked on a lot of people's farms. And that's a really good way to just kind of get a sense of the range of what you might expect, whether they're very consistent among farms, whether there's a lot of variation. Then you can look at comments. You'll see your comments, or in this case, yeah, you see your comments first, and then everybody else's. Some of them are about a specific rating. Some of them are overall comments like this. But scrolling through those can kind of give you a sense, like, is it mostly positive, mixed? Were there any really negative ones in there? So that's the basic tour. and we'll put those links in the email as well. All right. Well, if there are no more questions, let's say thank you and have a lovely rest of your day.